Okay. Good morning, Jivika. Can you hear us?
Yes, Suresh, I can hear you. Good morning.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah.
You can see me,
Okay.
right?
Yeah. We can put the video. Good morning, Jivika. Can you hear
Hello.
us?
Yes, Suresh, I can hear you. Good morning. I
Okay.
can hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
You can see me,
Okay.
right?
We can put the video. Morning, Jivika. Can you hear
Hello.
us?
Yes, Suresh, I can hear you. Good morning. I
Okay.
can hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think you can see me, right?
Repeating, no?
We can
Yeah.
put
This is what
the,
I talked
video.
1 minute ago.
Morning, Jivika. Can you hear
Hello.
us?
Yes, Suresh, I can hear you. Good morning. I
Okay.
can hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think you can see me, right?
Repeating, no?
We can
Yeah.
put
This is what
the,
I talked
video.
1 minute ago.
Morning, Jivika. Can you hear
Hello.
us?
Yes, Suresh, I can hear you. Good morning. I
Okay.
can hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think you can see me, right?
Repeating, no?
We can
Yeah.
put
This is what
the,
I talked 1 minute ago.
Morning, Jivika. Can you hear
Hello.
us?
Yes, Suresh, I can hear you. Good morning. I
Okay.
can hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think you can see me, right?
Repeating, no?
लाइव स्ट्रीम करनी है
We can
Yeah.
put
This is what
the,
I talked 1 minute ago.
Morning, Jivika. Can you hear
Hello.
us?
Yes, Suresh, I can hear you. Good morning. I
Okay.
can hear you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
I Hello. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you.
Okay.
කියලා කිව්ව දැන් මට කෝල් කරලා
Now it is okay, Manoj. Manoj? It is okay now.
Yeah, Jivika, now what's happening is some echo was there, so it was
Yes.
repeating what we were talking about.
Yeah. Because Jayasuriya is joining.
Wonderful.
Jayasuriya.
Yeah.
Very nice to see you. Suresh, do you know First Jayasuriya?
I only read his papers. I can't remember meeting him personally, but it's been what 40 years he has been writing, right?
Jivika,
Yes.
are you at Peradeniya or are you down in Colombo?
I'm joining from Peradeniya.
Okay, right.
Yeah, me and Pradeep. And Suresh is at IP.
Right. Right.
Good morning all. I think we can start now. I warmly welcome you all for the webinar on economic crisis, soaring food prices, and nutritional well-being options for safety net interventions in Sri Lanka. Actually, this is a part of both the monthly IPS in-house seminar series, as well as policy research capacity and influence (PRCI) program, It's kind of a consortium that includes International Food Policy Research Institute, USAID, and Michigan State University. So today's main focus is very important given the context of the country. As you all know, we are in the middle of the worst economic crisis since its independence in 1948. Especially the macroeconomic conditions of the country have deteriorated over time, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. So the government has taken several measures to respond to the crisis, like Sri Lanka declared a soft default of its debt services in April, and also a hard default a few days back, and also requested a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. So all these are interlinkages. We have interlinkages with the nutrition and food and nutrition security of the country. So especially economic crisis and the associated food price inflation have pushed a large segment of the Sri Lankan population into serious food and nutrition insecurity. So basically in this policy seminar, we are trying to address all these issues in three segments. First, a broad set of food and nutrition security challenges arising from the ongoing economic crisis. And also we are going to discuss potential options for redesigning nutrition-oriented social safety nets and lessons from implementing similar interventions in other developing countries. Let me introduce our presenters. We have three eminent speakers today. Dr. Suresh Babu. Suresh Babu is a senior research fellow and head of the capacity strengthening at the IFRI, based in Washington, D.C. And he was educated at Iowa State University before joining IFRI in 1992 as a research fellow. Dr. Babu was a research economist at Cornell University, New York, and between 1989 and 1994, he spent 5 years in Malawi on various capacities, like food policy advisor to the Ministry of Agriculture and also senior lecturer at the University of Malawi. At IFRI, he has been involved in institutional and human capacity strengthening for higher education and research in many countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, including Sri Lanka, for the past 23 years. We warmly welcome Dr. Suresh Babu. And the second speaker is Professor Jivika Veeraheva. I think most of you already know Professor Veeraheva. She is a senior professor at the Department of Agriculture, Economics and Business Management at the Faculty of Agriculture, University of Peradeniya. Professor Jivika obtained her BSc and MPhil degrees from the University of Peradeniya and PhD from the University of Guelph in Canada. She served as the head of the department and chairperson of the Board of Study in Agriculture Economics at the Postgraduate Institute of Agriculture. She is a collaborator of the International Food Policy Research Institute, a Hewlett Fellow of the International Agriculture Trade Research Consortium, and a Fellow of the Canadian Agriculture Trade Policy Research Network. Our third presenter is Dr. Pradeepa Koralagedara. She is a senior lecturer attached to the same department, Faculty of Agriculture, University of Peradeniya. Previous to this, she has held teaching and research positions at Griffith University, Australia, and Asia Pacific Regional Center, APRC, of United Nations Development Program based in Colombo. Her main research area includes food security, food safety, and livestock economics. She holds a BSc in Agriculture from the University of Peradeniya, MSc in Agriculture Economics from the University of Peradeniya, and PhD in Economics from Griffith University, Australia. So before going to the first presenter, let me introduce you a few housekeeping rules. The total duration of the webinar will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. So each presenter will have 10 to 15 minutes. After the three presentations, we will have minimum 45 minutes time for Q&A session. You can direct your questions or comments in the chat box or raise your hand and ask the questions. This will be live streamed on Facebook. First, I would like to invite Professor Jivika. Professor Jivika will talk about basically economic crisis and soaring food prices in Sri Lanka, causes for the problems and research questions. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Manoj, for that introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank the IPS for giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts on the economic crisis, food prices, and nutritional well-being. So Dr. Suresh Babu will share his international experience with respect to safety nets, and Dr. Korala Gedara and I will discuss about food prices and nutritional well-being. So that is our plan, and each one of us will take a maximum of 15 minutes. Okay, so let me start my presentation with the economic crisis and soaring food prices. In fact, nowadays, no special introduction to the current economic crisis is needed. We all know that we are having a huge debt burden, and our foreign reserves are declining, and we are facing what is known as twin deficit. We have a deficit in the current account as well as in the government budget. And of course, this has been a perennial issue, but things have aggregated with the lowering of taxes and attack. Both of them happened in 2019. Of course, COVID-19 pandemic contributed, but I would consider this as more of a perennial problem than a problem due to COVID-19 pandemic. So what happened is that with this macroeconomic situation, government started printing more and more money. And finally, when the government realized that exchange rate cannot be held at 200 rupees per US dollar, the government started floating the foreign currency. So the consequence was felt in the price levels, but when you look at food price levels in particular, you can see that food prices started escalating at a higher rate compared to the other. This diagram is borrowed from the Department of Census and Statistics, and you can see the CCPI for food and non-food items, and you can see that in April 2022, our food inflation was as high as 46%, whereas non-food inflation was 22%. So this is a serious issue in Sri Lanka because our people spend around 1/3 of our expenditure on food, and we are spending quite a lot on cereal, fish, vegetables, milk and milk food, then coconut meat and all that. So we really see a burden when we see an increase in prices of these items. So if you look at the changes in price levels from April 2021 to April 2022, you can see that most of these food items, the prices of these food items increased by more than 40%, but for certain items, they were over 100%. So not only food items, we can see an increase in prices of non-food items, particularly gas and fuel. And so the ability to purchase significantly decreases with such escalation. So the research questions ahead of us is, what are the causes behind this food inflation? Why food prices are escalating at a faster rate compared to the other items? And will this lead to a food crisis in the near future? So I actually do not have good answers to this. All what I can say is that I have some hypotheses, and I will throw these hypotheses to generate a discussion during the Q&A time. Okay, so we actually cannot say what causes what, because food items are different. Like some are tradable commodities, some are non-tradable, and some items are perishable, some are not, and some items are having inelastic demand by the consumers, and some are having elastic demand. So we actually cannot define a commodity called food. So it is a basket of different types of items. Okay. So the rise in food prices can be due to a number of factors, and I think that world market conditions affected, and the depreciation of currency, and also the government policies like removal of price ceilings and imposition of food import restrictions affected the food prices, and not only that, the hoarding adverse weather also affected our food price levels. So if I may take one by one, so we can see that this crisis is not unique to Sri Lanka. So due to different reasons, many countries in the world is showing some signs of food price escalation and even food crisis. So you can see what FAO produced, and most of the items you can see the March this year, but in April you can see a slightly downward trend. And this is also due to a number of reasons. Due to Russia-Ukraine war, you know that wheat market was affected. So we can see a rise in wheat prices in the world market, and petroleum oil prices and gas prices, as well as fertilizer prices are rising in the world market. And on top of that, countries like China and India started erecting export restrictions, and some supply disruptions also influence the world market conditions. So they inevitably transmit to our local conditions. So this actually was aggravated due to the depreciation of currency, and we all know that this is very sharp, and from within 2 months, like the value of our currency depreciated by around half, little less than half. So this affected the prices of food items, because we highly rely on imports to meet our food requirement. We import our entire requirement of wheat and red lentils, and we can produce only around 20 to 30% of our sugar requirement. For milk, it is like 40%. So we are a trade dependent country. So of course, our food prices go up whenever there is a rise in world market conditions and depreciation of currency. And this situation is worsened due to some of the actions by the government. And we looked at the rise in special commodity levies during the pandemic, and we noted that some serious effects can be seen with respect to food demand, and hence nutrient intake by population. So this study was done in 2020-2021 period, and right now we can see that some of the taxes were lowered. Right now we do not have large taxes on things like wheat and red lentil, but still our tax rates on milk and milk-based products are quite high. And The government also used other forms of import restrictions due to the balance of payment crisis, and certain imports are subjected to import licensing. Some imports were banned. A good example is fertilizer and black gram. And also certain restrictions were imposed when you purchase items under open licenses, and temporary suspensions were imposed. So all these things contributed to rise in food prices. In fact, the import bans on black gram and mung bean were imposed even prior to the COVID pandemic. And organic agriculture drive was a disaster. So this lasted for about 10 years, as well as extent cultivated. And right now we depend on imports of rice, and maize yields have gone down by over 65%. So all these things added to rise in price levels. Like when maize prices went up, broiler producers and egg producers found their enterprises highly unprofitable. So all these contributed to this food inflation. And the worst news is that by the time we got rid of the import ban on chemical fertilizers, we saw very high prices of fertilizer in the world market. So even though we do not have restrictions on fertilizer importation, now the cost of importation has become almost unaffordable. So we looked at the unit values of fertilizer faced by our economy, and we can see that fertilizer prices have gone up by 3 times. And the removal of price ceilings done in early November also affected the price levels of essential food items, and now we can pieces of wheat and wheat-based products due to the removal of price ceiling. And climatic factors also affected. Actually, climatic factors are crop dependent. For tea, we had a good year in 2021, so we actually did not even feel the pressure of losing chemical fertilizers. But for vegetables, of course, we had some bad patches. And people say that hoarding is a big issue, and this is done by consumers, processors, and even politicians hoard raw materials. And there are instances where urea was stockpiled by certain politicians, and I saw this in news. Okay, the issue is that will this soaring of food prices lead to a food crisis in Sri Lanka? So I do not have good answers, but I would say that it depends on the way that you define a food crisis. So most of the time we see that people define food crisis as a situation where food security is abruptly threatened, and people use food prices and shortage of food to measure the degree of the severity of food crisis. And most of the time I say that the term food crisis is synonymous with some extreme forms of malnutrition like hunger and starvation. And people say that a global food crisis will emerge in the near future. But what will happen in Sri Lanka back in early 70s, we truly had a food crisis. When we looked at the price level and the food shortages and the extent of malnutrition, we can see that it truly was a food crisis situation. And Gavan and Chandrasekhara did a very comprehensive study for IFRI in 1979 and showed all these numbers. So there was a reduction in calorie and protein consumption in early 70s compared to late 60s. And the food crisis in 2007-8 period did not affect Sri Lanka that much. And if you look at our food inflation in 2008, I got these numbers from the FAO. You can see that food inflation was quite high. Like if you look at world food inflation, even though we can see the peak, the numbers are lower, but in Sri Lanka, it was quite considerable. But we didn't feel it that much because our harvests were good. And during COVID-19 pandemic, of course, government incentivized agriculture production and even provided seeds and fertilizers free of charge. So domestic production was not that affected. But the present crisis is very uncertain. Of course, it is not something that came as a surprise. When it comes to the economic crisis, I know Professor Jayasurya and Dr. Dushni Veerakon, both are there in the audience. And this was very comprehensively analyzed and predicted by them, but the government didn't pay attention. Similarly, for the agri-food market effects due to fertilizer crisis was predicted. So in a way, this crisis is different. It was something that we predicted, and also we have some likely causes for the crisis. So finding solutions, hence, is not that difficult, but we really do not have sufficient data. So we might have to go for some simulation analysis, and Dr. Pradeepa Koralagedara will share with you what she found from a simulation analysis on the effect of these food prices on nutritional well-being of the country. Okay, so I shall stop share so that Dr. Koralagedara can start her presentation with her slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Dr. Manoj, shall I start the presentation?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you and good morning to everyone. So as Professor Jivika said, so we are experiencing an economic crisis, and this might have implication on food and nutrition security. So we did a small study to find out the effect of these food price increases on food security. And within the next 15 minutes, I will present the results of this study. Can you all see my slides?
Yeah, you can see. Yeah.
Okay. So as Professor Jivika said, we might head into a food crisis. So whether we are heading to food crisis or not, so what is obvious is food prices has increased in Sri Lanka. So the prices of rice has increased by 62% to 80%. So this range is given because we have different rice varieties. And the prices of bread and powdered milk has been more than double. And the prices of eggs has increased by 72%. And the prices of chicken has increased by 55%. Like vegetable prices has increased by 40%. So people have
Sorry,
started.
Pradeep, Dr. Pradeep, can you
Yes,
make it bigger in a presentation mode?
it's in the presentation mode. I'll share it again.
Okay.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, So people have started responding to these price increases. They have taken different coping strategies. So some people have adjusted their non-food expenditure. They are getting more money for food expenditure, and some have gone for short-term borrowings. And the people who are already spending a larger share of their income on food, so they find difficult to adjust their non-food expenditure. So they have changed their diet. So they have either reduced the diet quantity, like they have reduced the frequency of meal, or they have reduced the portion sizes, or they have reduced the quality of the diet. Usually, when there is a food crisis or increase in food prices, people move to more inexpensive, locally available food, which may or may not be nutritionally inferior. So whatever the coping strategies they are taking, except this first one where they adjust their non-food expenditure, they can have nutritional implications. So primary survey is the best to capture all these changes and the nutrition implications. However, in the absence of a primary survey, island-wide primary survey, we simulate the impact of food price hike on the diet cost. Okay, these are the study objectives. So first we assess the impact of economic crisis on the diet cost. So what we exactly did was we compare the current diet cost against the diet cost in 2019, that is pre-crisis time. And then by doing this, we try to identify the proportion of people, those who need assistance to access nutritious diet. Okay, this exercise was done using the software developed by Save the Children in 2005, which is called Cost of Diet. So let me first explain you about this software. So this software uses a linear programming technique to find out the combination of locally available food which fulfill the nutrient requirement of an individual or an household at a lower cost. So when it comes to these nutrients, so we have energy requirement, we have macronutrient requirement. So based on the nutrient specifications, the software is capable of calculating the cost of 4 types of diets. The first one is the energy only diet. So that try to fulfill the dietary energy requirement. And then we have micronutrient diet. The objective is to fulfill the macronutrients, protein, energy, and fat. And the nutritious diet is to fulfill the macronutrient as well as 13 micronutrients, which includes the vitamin and minerals. And then this last one, food habit nutrition diet. So it's try to estimate the cost of the diet which fulfill this nutrient requirement after accounting for the food consumption behavior. So like we have special preferences for certain food, and we have maybe we are not taking chicken every day, like those restrictions are there. So this food habit nutritious diet try to incorporate these behaviors into the program calculations. But since we don't have this data, what we did was we calculate the staple adjusted nutritious diet. That is, we try to incorporate at least the preference for staples. So that is, we consider rice and coconut as staples. So we tell the software that these are the frequencies that we take these foods. So that food groups will be definitely included in the combination of food they are producing. So if I talked about the data requirement for this, so to estimate the cost of least cost of the food combination, so the program need list of locally available food together with their nutrition composition and the price. And to estimate the nutrition requirement of the individual or the household, we need household composition and the nutrient requirement of the household members. The software has around 237 individuals. So these individuals vary based on their sex, age, the activity levels, and whether they are lactating, pregnant or not. So in addition to that, if we are to estimate the affordability, we need data on household income and expenditure as well. So here I gave the family I selected. So I estimated the cost of diet for a representative household. So my household include a child and school-age children, adolescent girl, lactating women, and an adult male. So I used data from prices were taken from Hector Kobak Agrarian Research Institute, And income and expenditure data was obtained from Census and Statistics, basically from HIS 2019. So this is our results. So this table shows the change in diet cost. So this gives the diet cost in 2019 May and 2022 April. So as you can see, the cost of the energy only diet is like 6,000 rupees in 2019, but now it's like 9,000 rupees. So this is like an increase of 3,000 rupees for energy adequate diet. If you take one person, so it is like 600 rupee increase in the food cost. But if you look at this nutritious diet, earlier in 2019 May, the cost is like 20,000 rupees. So with 20,000 rupees, we can afford a nutritious diet. But when it comes to 2022, so we should have about 35,000 to afford a nutritious diet. This is like an increase in 15,000. If we take per person increase, this is like 3,000 rupees. So now the cost per person has increased by 3,000 rupees. So this price increase as a percentage, as you can see, energy, the cost of the energy adequate diet has increased by 52%, and the cost of nutritious diet has increased by 80%. So just to give you an idea about this affordability of this diet to household, I just got the figure from HIS 2019, which gives the average household expenditure. It is 63,113. So out of this food expenditure, 35% is usually spent on food, that is like 22%. So as you can see, now it is not enough. So everyone has to come up with some kind of a coping strategy to face this challenge. Okay. In addition to this cost of the diet, the software produced some other interesting figures as well. One of these figures is the food basket. So as you can see, so if you look at this food basket, in both time period, food basket includes these food items: bread, rice, cowpea, fish, egg, milk powder, bitter gourd, leeks, okra, pumpkin, coconut, avocado, and orange. So we have prices for more than 60 commodities. But these commodities were picked up by the software because these are inexpensive, nutrition-rich foods. So I indicate this fish and avocado in red color here because in 2019 food basket, these food items were included, but in 2022, these were not included. In place of fish, we have cowpea in 2022 food basket. It may be because of the relative changes in prices. So now I would like to bring your attention to this graph. So there are a few interesting points about this graph. One is, as I mentioned, fish. So fish will be there in the food basket only in 2019. 2020, fish is not there. And the other interesting feature is the expenditure share on vegetable and vegetable product. It has increased. As compared to 2019 figure, it's a big increase. Now vegetable has become a cheap nutrient source compared to other food groups. So another feature that I wanted to highlight is in 2019 as well as in 2022, the food basket contained a lot of egg, like per day, we have to take one egg because egg is an inexpensive, nutritionally dense product. Then the software gives the individual diet cost as well. So this pie chart will indicate the individual cost share of the household diet cost. So as you can see, 1/3 of the household diet cost is spent on adolescent girls and another 1/3 is spent on lactating women. So like 2/3 of the household diet cost is spent on these individuals. Still, they are not meeting their nutrient requirements. Like they cannot meet their iron requirement. Especially this 2020 food basket will fulfill only to 44% of their iron requirement. So lactating women is little better, like at least she can fulfill 98% of her iron requirement. But for adolescent girls, the available food does not guarantee the requirement of iron. Okay, let's move to a more interesting figure that's about the diet affordability. So as you can see, we have two figures here. One is for May 2019, the other one is for April 2022. So in this graph, the x-axis is the income decile and the y-axis is the percentage of income spent on different commodities, different expenditure groups. So as you can, food expenditure on different food types. So as you can see, in 2019, if you look at this, people in the 10th income decile, so by spending around 45% of their income, they can afford a nutritious diet. So that's a very big flexibility for them. Whenever the prices increase, they can adjust their income. But if you look at this, the people in the first income decile or the lowest income decile, so with even if they spend 100% of their income, they were not in a position to fulfill their nutritious food requirement. So when it comes to 2022, so it's like a verse. So first, for the people in the lowest 4 income deciles were not able to fulfill their nutritious food requirement with the income that they are having. Even if you think about this 5th income decile, so it's like they are almost spending like 99% of their income on food. So all these 5 groups are in a danger. They are vulnerable to food insecurity situation. So it's like half of the population will be food insecure soon. So now the most important thing that we wanted to know is how much additional amount of money we should give to these people to make them food and nutrition secure. So the software calculate that figure as well. Based on that figure, we can calculate it. So this is what we found. So to bring the people who are in the 4th income decile to a desirable level, we need to transfer Sri Lankan rupees 903 per month. And to bring the people in the 3rd income decile out of the food insecurity situation, we have to transfer around 2,000 rupees per month. And when it comes to the 1st income decile, so we have to transfer around 5,000 rupees per person per month. So it is like if we have a household with 4 members, so we have to give 20,000 rupees per month. So this is like a lot, but that is what they need. And we have to move forward from here. So we need to look at how we can do that. So I just try to brief you about the support that we already have. So Sri Lanka has a very good history of providing food assistance and even the cash transfer payments. So we have both nutrition specific interventions as well as nutrition sensitive interventions. So these nutrition specific interventions include school meal programs, reposure program, multiple micronutrient supplementary program, and vitamin A supplements. And nutrition sensitive interventions include some of the like food transfer, cash transfer programs. And this might even include the transfer payments the government made during the COVID situation. If you look at the effectiveness of these programs, so it is universally accepted that if you want to reduce the nutrition insecurity, nutrition specific interventions are better than nutrition sensitive interventions. However, if you look at the government expenditure per person, usually the government allocate more on nutrition sensitive interventions. So if you want to talk about the effectiveness of these programs, we need to look at 4 criteria. One is the size of the benefit transfer, whether we are giving an adequate support. So the second one is a target. So when it comes to target, there are 2 things. One is whether these programs include the people who actually need the assistance. And the second one is whether these programs include the people who are not qualified to receive this benefit. So if we are including the people who are not qualified to receive this benefit, the benefit going to the people who need it will reduce. So the third one is a form of the support. So that is whether we are going to give them cash or whether we are going to give them the food. And then the fourth one is the implementation inefficiencies. I haven't done any in-depth analysis about the efficiency of these programs, but I thought it would be better just to present well-known facts about this program. So we are spending a lot of money on the Samurdhi program, but per person benefit is 2,427 in 2020. So there was a suggestions to include this by 28%. So this suggestion came in last February. I'm not sure whether it has done now. So even if it has been done, the amount that is allocated per person is not adequate. So if you go with this number 2,427 per person, we are giving only 625 Sri Lankan rupees, which is not even adequate to buy a 400 gram powdered milk packet now. And the other inefficiency in the Samurdhi program is, so if you can see this graph, I took this graph from ILO report. This report has been done in 2016. So it says 6% of the research quartile also included as beneficiaries in the Samurdhi program. So if we can reduce these inefficiencies and make stronger, then we will be able to get the benefit of these Samurdhi program. And the next famous food assistance program that we have is, one is the school meal program, the other one is the Triposha program. So this school meal program is implemented as a joint initiative by the government and the WFP. So the allocation per student is Sri Lankan rupees 28 per meal. So now it's not enough at all. And then the worst thing is, this is not enough. The same way the allocation has been reduced from $1.6 billion to $1.2 billion for this year. So the money would be enough only to give this assistance for one term. And then if you look at this Triposha program, again, it's given to pregnant mothers, lactating mothers, and the malnourished preschool children. It says now it is not received by these vulnerable groups. So being an economist, it's difficult to, I know how difficult it is to increase the allocation for this food assistance program. However, I think given the repercussions this could have, it's important to invest on these programs right now. Okay, with that, I would like to conclude my session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pradeepa. Actually, now we have finished our first two presentations, basically covering the domestic situation of the food and nutrition security situation. So Professor Jivika started with giving how economic crisis translated into the food insecurity situation, and basically the factors that contributed to economic factors that contributed to food insecurity situation of the country. Then Dr. Pradeepa especially focused on the nutritional aspects, and also using linear programming, she has calculated the cost of minimum cost of diet with different nutritional status, and also what income deciles are more affected because of this food insecurity situation comparatively with 2019 and 2022. So now we are moving into the international experiences. So Dr. Suresh Babu will take us through kind of safety nets during crisis times, what works and where, what lessons can be learned from the international experiences. So over to you, Dr. Suresh.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj. This has been truly a collaborative activity with the University of Peradeniya, Dr. Jivika, Dr. Pradeepa, and Dr. Manoj facilitating this seminar. I truly thank you for that. Just to introduction to our own collaboration, IFPRI has been, as Jivika showed in a slide, the Gavan and Chandrasekhara study in 1979 was undertaken with IFPRI. So it kind of shows the 40-year association of IFPRI with Sri Lankan policy system. And I was fortunate to come into this about 23 years ago when we started working with Dr. Saman Kaligama, IPS, and in the South Asia PANSA, Policy Analysis and Advisory Network of South Asia, in which IPS was a key member, and later on, which turned to, we formed RESAX Asia, much broader than South Asia, where IPS and Peradeniya and Dr. Manoj, Dr. Jivika, they are all part of that. So RESAX Asia now, that's Regional Analysis and Knowledge Support System for Asia, is an entity that supports our work right now in this activity, as well as PRCI, which is supporting IPS in a small way to respond to policy needs in terms of research, evidence generation, and policy communication through set of studies that we collectively undertake in the region. So just a background information. So it gives me a pleasure to be here personally in Sri Lanka, although it's a difficult period for the country, but I'm glad I could be in the region and take this opportunity to visit IPS. So I'm coming from IPS to you right now. So let's start the presentation. I also want at the moment, at the same time, thank Dr. Dushani for her collaborative support and leadership. I see Dr. Jayasurya is also on the audience, from whom we have all learned a lot about Sri Lankan agricultural economy and food security and related issues. So let me quickly bring some perspective on how at the crisis, during the crisis times, what the safety nets have done and how they have worked, and what lessons broadly we can learn given the short time period, and we can kind of present some ideas and then we can discuss that. Actually, collectively, Dr. Jivika, Dr. Pradeepa, and I are preparing this policy brief that will be based on this presentation, and we will share that with you when it is ready, and that will give you the details of these lessons that we are talking about. So let me move on to this broad experience. The recent major food crisis, so to speak, and Dr. Jivika talked about what is food crisis and so on. The various definitions exist, but then we all agree that during 2009, we had a major food crisis, and we were all part of it in terms of learning from that and also facing policymakers, guiding policymakers, and so on. So it kind of, when we were kind of globalizing our economies, which was happening in the early 2000s, if you remember, with the WTO opening up and countries joining and then opening up the markets and so on. That broad globalization phenomenon also brought a lot of opportunities. At the same time, it also exposed the countries to the global markets, particularly in global food price instability. When global price volatility happened, then the countries were already exposed because they were also globalized. So that's a kind of double-edged sword in that sense, that you get the benefits of globalization. At the same time, you have to be cautious and be careful in making sure that our population is not, a vulnerable population particularly, is not affected by the globalized event. That's what is happening right now. But in 2028 and 2009, we saw the confluence of food, fuel, and financial crisis. They all coming together and reinforcing each other, if you remember that. So that is kind of similar to what we are facing right now, because with the ongoing COVID-19, we are not yet out of the woods, as they say. We are still wearing masks. We are still, seeing cases rising in many parts of the world. New variants are emerging. I was in South Africa just 10 days ago, and there is new variants coming. So we are not yet out of the woods in terms of this ongoing COVID-19. But at the same time, we are also having the Ukraine war, and also sometimes the policies of unprepared governments also contribute. So this so-called food crisis, we are talking about food crisis. People are expecting that there will be a major impact on the food economy in many countries. And in fact, International UN Security Council actually debated about the global food situation a few days ago, if you noticed in the news. So it has become a global issue. It's not just an issue for Sri Lanka. But the broader context is, how do we protect the poor and the vulnerable when this kind of disruptions happen and the shocks happen? How do we build it back in terms of a resilient economy, and what can we learn from it, and how do, in the short run, protect the poor and vulnerable? It's something that we can learn from the past. In the during the 2008-2009 crisis, IFPRI did undertake several policy consultations in many countries that were seriously affected, both in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, on the preparedness. How do we prepare for a future in terms of responding to future shocks and instabilities, right? So I just kind of want to summarize some of the major lessons just for you to think and correlate with the current situation. During that time, we saw countries that were integrated well into the global markets were also affected by the food crisis. Quickly, they were able to see the impact of the global phenomenon. The price transferring mechanisms were quick, but they could also recover fast because of their ability to manage the trade flow, particularly in the food commodities. So that's a broad lessons we could draw from earlier. So if you are integrated in the world market, and be integrated in a way that you can also take advantage of the world market as well, and your trade flow, that requires a little bit of analysis of the trade flows, where you stand. And in fact, the recent study that we did with collaboratively with IPS took the leadership in studying the trade flows. Just last year, they finished the study. So that can give us some evidence for this kind of analysis. Okay, what is the trade flow of Sri Lanka in food commodities, and how that the kind of trade flow analysis could help inform, particularly when we want to recover from the food crisis that is coming up. The second lesson we learned: countries that had well-developed safety net systems already in place, the social infrastructure, the distribution infrastructure, were able to prevent the serious forms of hunger and malnutrition. Some examples include Brazil. The Zero Hunger program was already there, which is very well known, as you know. They won World Food Prize for that program. And Bangladesh is another example. India also, and China, they all had some strong. And like Dr. Jivika said, Sri Lanka also had the safety net programs, and because of the good harvest, good production system, domestically, you were strong in terms of production at that time. You didn't feel that effect of that crisis on the poor and the vulnerable at that time, right? So so knowing that, having a system on the ground that quickly responds to protect the vulnerable will be an important thing. So that's a second lesson. The third lesson says the immediate food-based interventions are needed to prevent the vulnerability. So we can debate about cash transfer versus food transfer, the inefficiencies of food transfer and efficiency of cash transfer. Even with all those debates, and it is context specific, how do we prevent further vulnerability of the people from hunger and malnutrition? It is we can start with immediately a food transfer mechanism, but then that can be translated into a viable system of cash transfer and so on. So that's the third lesson. Finally, strengthening the existing safety net programs is very important. We talk about Triposha, we talked about Samruddhi in Sri Lanka, school feeding programs. How do we reinforce with additional support? And that's the stage that we are in Sri Lanka, thinking about how can we use additional resources to reinforce what already is on the ground. That's a quick kind of way to intervene and protect the poor and the vulnerable. And of course, we need to be thinking about expanding the system. Even 2008, 2009, we were thinking about how to expand the existing systems to include the recent poor. Recent poor meaning that the poor who are on the borderline, just above the poverty line, but just because of the shock, they have just fallen below the poverty line, or the people just below the poverty line just fallen even deeper into poverty. But then, of course, through better targeting and targeting issues that Dr. Pradeepa talked about, the error of inclusion, error of exclusion, and so on. So this is a broad set of lessons that we already learned from the literature that looked at the food crisis during the last food crisis. But then in the specific context of Sri Lanka, for some pointers I want to share. Maybe we can debate and discuss and share ideas because I see excellent set of participants, well-informed participants in this seminar. So just basically to start with, of course, we need to get the macroeconomic environment right, the policies right as soon as possible. And then there is quite a bit of debate going on, and maybe Dr. Jayasurya can give us some insights from his recent seminar that they had from Australia. That would be useful for us. And also think about multiple pathways of protecting the poor and the vulnerable. That pathways can include quickly intervening in terms of emergency crop activities, production activities, helping the production system to grow quick crops, for example, short duration crops that can assure food at the local level. And also think about the effective functioning of the markets. And Dr. Jivika talked about hoarding, for example. How can we come up with the regulations quickly to avoid such poor functioning of markets? That's very important. And of course, improve the efficiency of the social service provision. And also is also important through the social safety nets as well. So the multiple pathways need to be thought about, and it's not just safety nets alone. So we need to think about that. But we need to be, on the cropping side or production side, we need to be thinking about next season to focus on local production. There are two issues here. The regular production of the crops may be disturbed, interrupted, mainly because the fertilizer prices are going up in the international level. If you are dependent on fertilizer imports for those crops, then there will be some disappointment, both in terms of availability and also in prices. So we need to be prepared for that. What are the alternatives in terms of both crop production, cropping patterns, as well as protecting the farmers from the high fertilizer price by encouraging them to even start composting, the raw materials and growing even a short-term green manure crop and in situ plowing back into the system. So the extension system needs to really get geared up to work with the farmers at this point for the next season. Allowing food markets to function freely is very important. The restrictions, and look at where the restrictions come from, how we can help in terms of incentivizing the marketing partners, market stakeholders, in order to effective functioning of the market, but also monitor the prices. We already talked about the hoarding, and make sure that doesn't happen, and provide incentives for people to bring the food to the market as well. So that's a kind of careful analysis is needed in terms of market integration and how the markets flow in terms of food commodities from the production zone to the consumption zone, and so on. So that's a follow-up kind of analysis is needed, of course. And we do have in Sri Lanka quite a bit of studies already to understand those issues. Effective use of international negotiations. You are already having negotiations with IMF. How can we use the evidence-based analysis? And I'm very proud to be participating with IPS and University of Peradeniya, because they are already jumping in to analyze the situation, not standing on the sidelines and watching what is happening, right? So you are already participating in the debate. You are already giving the evidence for the policymakers to start debating, and also giving ammunition for our policymakers to go better negotiate with IMF and World Bank and other international donor community. And that is very, very important. And the role that IPS, leading policy think tank, and Peradeniya and leading academic institutions in the food and agriculture area playing is very commendable. And we are from IFPRI, from Michigan State, USAID, we are very fortunate and very proud of associating with you on that. But also to negotiate with regional partners. How do we work with India, with China, with Bangladesh, with Pakistan, who are our traditional partners in food trade? How can we negotiate with them if we are in serious difficulty in terms of exchange, foreign exchange? Can we have negotiations with them? And countries do that all the time. And if needed, can we get some food aid as needed, right, from our neighbors? And that's how the regional SARC kind of system can operate, and regional bodies can work in that context. So we need to start negotiating and start dialogue at that level. Finally, I talked about the emergency of introduction of emergency crops such as sweet potato that grow very fast, and other crops that are already been suggested by agronomists and scientists from University of Peradeniya. I think we should follow that from the extension and intervention from the production side as well, because markets are going to be disrupted and trade is going to be slow. And how can we get the food to the farmers in their own communities is very important. So these are the broad set of issues. that we can think about in the context of Sri Lanka, but then experience from the specific safety net programs, we need to be thinking about a broad policy environment that supports the safety net intervention as well. Let's look at what policymakers are thinking, where are they going to put money in, and how we can guide that process. The policy environment is need to be guided as well. So we need to take a look at this implementation issue that Dr. Pradeepa talked about. What is the institutional architecture? Can we use this crisis as an opportunity to revamp the institutional architecture to make it more efficient? Both at the national level thinking process as well as at the decentralized levels, right? So there is quickly opportunity to restructure our activities and even modify them to meet the future shocks and future instability that we may face. Learning from this experience. So we need to be also developing a system that reaches poor and vulnerable directly with food and nutrition assistance. That's very important as well. Continue this direct assistance so that the food is available at the household level and for the individual members who are vulnerable. And we need to develop a better system of course, targeting the poor and the vulnerable. We already talked about that. And how do we come up with a better targeting mechanism to reduce the inefficiency? That's very important as well. This is an opportunity to learn that process much more deeper. Develop right combination of the food delivery. That's exactly what we were talking about, least cost diet. And I'm glad that Dr. Pradeepa dig deeper into that using a linear programming model. And that's becoming very popular, although we have been doing this for the last 30 years in various countries. And these techniques, these models, these small tools are very handy in terms of identifying the right combinations of food in a least cost diet manner, right? At the same time, keeping the dietary diversity in place. But also we need to monitor what is happening in the programs that we introduce, evaluate them, give the feedback to the policymakers and program implementers. And that should be in place already as we start implementing. Learning from the past, of course, is very important. Reinventing the future is also important based on the past lessons. And I strongly believe that given that we are committed as a team of researchers working together for the betterment of our poor and the vulnerable, the best times are yet to come. Let's go through the crisis, but we have always been coming out of this strongly, successfully, and more resilient. Thank you so much. Dr. Manoj, back to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Suresh. You gave a good account of different insights that we can learn from the international experiences to kind of get rid of the current problem that we are facing that presented by Professor Jivika as well as Dr. Pradeepa. So now I think where we can directly go to the Q&A session. So participants can raise your hands then and you can direct the question directly to whoever that you want to direct your question. First, I can see so anybody? Can't see any hands raised.
Dr. Manoj, may I ask, taking advantage of Dr. Jayasurya for a few minutes, we want to learn from him what came out of the Melbourne discussions at the macroeconomic level. If I may indulge Dr. Jayasurya in that, it will be useful as participants are thinking about their questions.
Yeah, definitely. Professor Jayasurya, over to you. I think you are muted.
Yeah. We haven't had the webinar yet in Melbourne. It is actually going to be tomorrow, and
okay.
And Dr. Virokon would be part of it. But I'm just looking at and listening to the numbers that the team was presenting. What I was just flabbergasted at how extensive and deep the current crisis seems to be. If anything, I suspect that this is much bigger in scope and deeper in its effects than the early 1970s crisis we had. I sent a question to Pradeepa privately through the chat function. I mean, whether I was getting it right, that basically 40% of the people, 40% of the people are going to be unable to afford to have a reasonable diet, even if they use all their household income. And that actually goes up to about 50% if you, even the fifth decile is still almost at the margin whether they can afford to have a reasonable diet. And that is on top of the overall inflation, which is raising the cost of living across the board on a whole heap of other essentials, fuel, transport, and so on, to get clothing and stuff. And so that kind of suggests to me that what we are facing is a major disaster, and it's happening precisely at the time when we will be under huge pressure to cut the fiscal deficit, the government budget, government spending across the board. Even assuming that we are going to get some finance from the IMF and our external financing needs addressed at least to a limited extent, one of the conditions will be that the government drastically cuts down expenditure. And we already have a chronic budget deficit, large and chronic deficit, which has been going on for decades. So in that context, the challenge is, how are you going to expand the transfer programs as they need to be expanded to meet basic dietary needs of the vulnerable population, which now comprises, 50% or more. I must confess, I can see the problem, but I can't see an answer. And so I'm very pessimistic about how the situation is going to pan out. In Sri Lanka, you can see obvious areas where fiscal deficit can be either reduced or at least, some steps can be taken. Half the government salary budget goes on the military. We have 300,000 of the most able-bodied people locked up in barracks. And even if you just keep paying them, but let them go out and work, will actually expand the labor force engaged in productive activity, and that would increase output, because a lot of these people come from villages, and that could add to agricultural production if they're just told, we'll keep paying you, so you don't have to get up and have an uprising, but you can go and work and produce food. But that's obviously not going to happen. So I just cannot see. People at IPS might have a better perspective on what is feasible. I can just see a huge challenge with no obvious answers.
Thank you, Professor Jayasuriya. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
Dr. Manoj, Dr. Dushni has raised her hand.
Yes, Dr. Dushni.
Manoj, and let me first of all, I apologize to Dr. Babu that I was not able to be at office today to have a meeting with him because of the fuel crisis. We are also working from home to conserve energy as much as possible before we are able to fill up our tanks. And thank you also to Jivika and for that wonderful presentation, as well as the one on estimating the nutritional deficiency that was done. I mean, I agree with what Professor Jayasuri was saying. I mean, it's a very tight set of conditions that we are facing, but I think, you know, we are not unique in terms of the food inflation and food price, you know, in scarcity factors, etc. That you know, it's now a global issue. But I have a, you know, when I was listening to the nutritional deficiency part of it, one thing that has come out from research that we've been doing at IPS, my colleagues at IPS also, is that even when food prices were affordable, if you look at child malnutrition in Sri Lanka, which is a bit of an outlier, that there are certain cultural and other practices that means that, you know, even if you do have the money, you're not spending it on nutritional food. So even, you know, my question is the malnutrition deficiencies that we are identifying, how critical is it? Because, you know, it's been so much a part of the ongoing story of malnutrition that we've been researching for so long in Sri Lanka anyway. And my second question is on the, I saw some of the what's being proposed now at a global level, that countries should try to shorten their food supply chains and focus on national food production to tide over this crisis, which sort of may or may not be prolonged. In that context, I mean, is that sensible policy advice to a country like Sri Lanka, where our agriculture productivity levels are low? We are very highly dependent on things like fertilizer. Can that be a policy measure, to a sensible policy measure to raise or put our limited resources to raising national food production levels in the you know, short to medium term? I'm not directing them to any of the panelists, but you know, just anyone has any.
Dr. Manoj, shall I answer the question on this nutritional part?
Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Dushni, I fully agree with you. So with our food consumption behavior, so we are not even accessing the food that we can. For example, if you look at this nutrition adequate diet and staple adjusted diet, nutrition adequate diet actually fulfill the nutrient requirement of the lactating women, but the staple adjusted diet does not, because we impose restrictions on the consumption quantities of consumption frequency of rice and coconut. So our food behavior definitely restrict us from getting access to these nutrients. The other question is about this, how bad it is. So we already have a higher percentage of stunting and wasting, but the problem is here we are talking about a nutrition adequate diet. People will be able to afford the energy adequate diet, but they won't be able to get the micronutrients. So that will be reflected maybe in 10 years or 20 years. It will impact on brain development of preschool children, and it will have an impact on the next generation if the lactating and the pregnant mothers will be nutritionally deficient. So we will see these, we will see the repercussion in 10 years or 20 years. I'm not sure whether I answered your question.
Yes, you did, Pratibha. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Manoj, can I add to that?
Yeah, Professor Jivika.
Yeah. Yeah, so I agree with Dr. Dushni as well as with Dr. Pradeep, of course. Food taboos, myths, and all these influence food consumption behavior, hence nutrition. However, I want to emphasize, however, we did a study about 3 years back. Pradeep and I are the co-authors. What we did was we gathered every single study conducted in Sri Lanka on malnutrition, and we systematically reviewed them to identify what are the promising determinants of malnutrition in Sri Lanka. So what we saw was that it is income. So income is the number one. All the other things contribute, but income is the number one. So it is an economic issue more than a cultural or social issue. So if you give money, if you lower prices of food items, it will help in alleviating malnutrition. So actually, this is not only in Sri Lanka. In many developing countries, even the global literature say that it is basically an income phenomena than anything else. But others, of course, contribute. But I do not discount or underestimate about nutrition. And with respect to shortening of supply chains, in fact, we have been having this policy for some time. Like if you look at what we practiced since 2005, it is for protecting local production, promoting local production, and I think that policy framework also added to this economic crisis. Like people tend to forget the fact that the moment you impose a tax on imports, it becomes a tax on exports. And I have been asking Professor Jayasuriya, like why people cannot understand this general economic effect, like our resources are limited. The more you support importable, the more you discourage export. So I confidently say that it should not be the long-term development strategy for the country. However, in a crisis situation, you simply cannot go by economic principles. Like you have to somehow or other help the vulnerable, help the poor. So home garden, cultivation of crops and rearing of animals in your own gardens would help. So shortening of supply chains, community management, exchanges among neighbors, like all these things will help. But I don't think that the government should spend so much resources on this. Of course, government can do some giving out resources is to be done after doing some serious research. So what I'm trying to say is that the resources from commercial agriculture to sustainable agriculture. So that happened, like even during the pandemic time, we freely distributed fertilizers and seeds, and some of these seed stocks were the stocks that were retained for the. So I don't think that we that extent, but of course we can encourage people to use their own resources for home production, and the government should at least now understand where the markets are. We have to extensively find ways to identify overseas markets and the niches, and also the commodities with comparative advantage, both food and non-food crops, and divert our resources to growing sectors. And everywhere in the world, you can see that more than primary agriculture, it is the food enterprises that show higher productivity levels. So those are the areas that we should support. Thank you.
Yeah, next, Priyanka can go ahead, and then Kimutu.
Yeah, thank you very much for this is a very high that timely topic on discussing on this that current food crisis and this how it will affect that nutrition of the people. So regarding that the factors affecting for this nutrition, actually that our research we found that that socio-cultural practices also highly affect, especially in that estate sector, that the consuming that higher that more wheat flour is a major reason for that higher malnutrition in the estate sector. And also, I would like to ask that from Dr. Pradeepa, having this food cost analysis, have you considered that regional level existing food availability and that any regional variation, or have you considered that into your analysis?
Thank you, Dr. Priyanka. It's a very good question. Actually, a cost of diet software is used to calculate the diet cost for regional, like localities, for small areas, because it consider about the availability of locally available foods. Therefore, it is not recommended to estimate one figure for island. But since we don't have that data, I estimated this for the island. So this is not for I did not account for the regional differences. I know there could be a difference if we can account for this food consumption behavior and even the prices, because estate people consume a lot of meat. So for them, maybe the staple will not be the rice and coconut. There would have been difference if I consider that regional differences as well. But for this study, no, I did not.
Okay, Dr. Pradeepa, right. Thank you.
Kimutu, you can go ahead.
I asked the question, I'll ask it again. I got a reply for it. So is it wise to increase the amount of Samurdhi transfer rather without streamlining the beneficiaries? So it's giving food rations to selected vulnerable groups an option. This is to Dr. Pradeepa.
Yes, yeah. Samurdhi, actually, even if you want to increase the transfer payment, then we have to reduce the inefficiencies in the program. So we need to pay more attention for the targeting issue that we have, as well as she said, like we can think about the better form of support that we are giving. Samurdhi is not a food assistance program. It's an income transfer payment. It's a poverty alleviation program. It has many components. So if you really wanted to target food, I think food stamp will do a better job, because people will not be able to spend that for any other thing. So if you can give a food stamp, but then again, it will be difficult to select this vulnerable group. Usually we depend on the income level, monthly income or the annual income level. So the government workers or others, it's easy to get them to identify whether they are vulnerable or not. But when the people are engaged in the informal sector, so it's very difficult to target them. Maybe the people who should not get the benefit also will be included.
Okay, thank you, Pradeepa. I have one question. This is actually regarding hoarding. I think both Dr. Suresh and Professor Jivika talked about this hoarding issue. I know that now this hoarding was highly discussed and debated in recent time in Sri Lanka related to paddy rice, because millers, it's said that millers are like collecting unnecessary stocks of paddy to get unnecessary advantage. So this thing, especially now the problem in Sri Lanka is we don't have any measure or any method to measure the available stocks in different stages of the value chain. So my question is first one probably to Professor Jivika and Dr. Pradeepa, whether is it possible for us to introduce a method like compulsory declaration of stocks at each level of value chain in Sri Lanka? And the second one is to Dr. Suresh Babu. Is there any international experience related to this type of solution, or any other solution that you can propose in terms of unnecessary hoarding?
Yes, a quick answer to your question, Manoj. In fact, getting information from the processing sector is one of the most difficult tasks. So even if you make this compulsory, I do not know to what extent we can gather this information, and I also do not know how other countries do this. So one of the issues that we faced in estimating market power of the rice milling sector is that we do not have uh, data on industry concentration. Like people say that 3 or 4 millers run the entire industry, but when you really collect data, you actually find that it is not under the same name. Like even though one big miller is controlling everything, he has registered his or her partners under different names. So you really do not see this in practice. So I do not have an answer. So what I'm trying to say is that our private sector is acting in a very peculiar way, and they know how to bend rules. And I don't think that with the lobbying power and all these exchanges between the private sector and the politicians, we can regulate the private sector through this kind of regulations. Thank you.
Manoj, if I can come in, it's a good question actually. And if you recall in the history of famines, particularly Bengal famine in India, was the result of not shortage of food. It was result of hoarding, result of food not being able to go from one place to another because people speculated and hoarded the food. And it comes very clearly if you look at the book by Professor Amartya Sen, The Poverty and Famines. It's clear from that. So it's a major cause for famine. And also, if you look at Markets and Famines, Market Rebellion book on Bangladesh, he also talks about that in detail. So we have good history documentation of hoarding as a cause for food crisis or even famine, right? So building on that, in the Indian context, which I am very familiar with, growing up during the 70s, and when the rice mills were, established, and they, with the Green Revolution, the rice mills took major role in processing the rice paddy. They were all registered. They were all small mills. They were not huge ones that control the markets, right? So in every panchayat, as we say, a collection of villages, you will have a rice mill owned by a local large farmer, actually. It is like a rural industrialization, so to speak, driven by paddy, Green Revolution. And what happened was each one of them were registered by the government, and they had to document how much rice comes in, how much they process, and how, and that information is very clear. On top of that, so you can monitor who is doing what, and they didn't have huge go down secretly somewhere, they process and then go spare. What they do is they process and give the rice back to the people who bring it to the processing mill, right? So it's a different structure there. But what we can learn from that is that the registration and documentation and monitoring can be useful as we move along, as you build that system more. Second aspect of it is as you know, food MSP and procurement of food and the paddy, particularly paddy and wheat, and also the stock management by Food Corporation of India, which holds now close to 60 million tons, which is, again, we as market interventionists, we think that it is a waste of resources and so on. But then they are not giving up that role, mainly because I know it's a huge country. Any part of the country can go into crisis anytime. And that's the argument for a long time from the economists who argue for, even though it is inefficiency of Food Corporation of India, it's worth paying for in case you face another famine. Okay, so this fear of famine continues both in Bangladesh, where I work closely, as well as in India. So it is not an easy solution, but it is, to me, it looks like we should study that more. How do we decentralize the processing of paddy? How do we create small enterprises coming into the paddy industry rather than monopoly of 4 or 5 big rice millers? It's something to think about. It is an opportunity to analyze this market structure, analyze the value chain itself. How can we reorganize the value chain in the paddy and rice value chain? So that's what I would think, and I look this at an opportunity. Maybe we can do a study on that quickly and help the government to reorganize, using the crisis as an opportunity. So say, hey, we have to do things differently in order to avoid this crisis in the future. Let me stop there, Manoj.
Thank you. I think what you propose on strengthening small and medium holders to face the monopolistic competition. Actually, during the last regime, they tried this method, strengthening the SME sector, kind of a cooperative arrangement, so that they can face the monopolistic competition well. But the problem was didn't continue it because of the regime change. It actually had a natural death.
Yeah, political economy affects that too. Yeah, any policy is affected with political economy, right? That we need to study and understand too. Yeah.
Professor Jayasuri, you have anything to add? You are muted. You are muted, Professor Jayasuri.
I totally agree with what Suresh said. Hoarding is, it has been an issue for thousands of years, from ancient Rome onward, and it remains an issue. And we know that it creates problems in situations like this. But at the same time, we also know that it is one of the most difficult things to eradicate. So long as there are incentives for private traders to hoard, they will hoard. So they will balance at the margin the cost of getting caught and punished versus the gains to be made by hoarding and selling at a higher price later. It's a classic speculation thing, but it is also in normal times, people, it's a market stabilizing thing that private storage decisions made by traders actually tends to stabilize the market. It can create big problems in crisis situations, but so it's a very difficult issue. But I think the fundamental, while I totally agree that this is an area that we should look at, and we also I don't want to mention, we know who used to have a big monopoly of rice trade in the Poronaru area, and why those things were untouchables. And it has remained difficult to address. The political economy behind it is very powerful. Interest at work has been around for a very long time. But I think just immediate period ahead, I think it is the real supply issue that is going to create the way out. While all these other measures can help, often governments use this to say the problem is caused by traders hoarding, when in fact the underlying problem is a chronic deficiency in supply. And when you have that situation, you just got to address the fundamental problem. And if we can, if we can't import enough wheat and enough rice and enough other food stuff, we are going to not easily get out of it. But secondly, the issue that Dushni mentioned in terms of domestic food production, when prices go through the ceiling, people, there's a private supplier response. People start producing substitute foods. They will go to, start producing cassava and sweet potatoes and so on. That happened in the early 70s too, when we had the food crisis here. There was an increase in the production of I shouldn't say non-traditional, minor, what used to be minor staples like sweet potatoes and cassava and millets and things like that. But that's still a very temporary measure. It's certainly not likely to address the nutrition issue, but it might address the calorie issue at least. But other than the government facilitating through provision of seeds and planting material and so on, I think there wouldn't be much that the government can in practice do immediately, but those things can help. Provision of planting material, etc., because the price incentives are very high. So farmers and even people who don't farm, backyard, home garden farming and so on, you will see a supply response. But the scale of the problem, I think, one, you have to separate the immediate short-term issue of addressing the food shortages and the high prices, which is really the issue. It's not even an absolute shortage as, high prices, because the currency has collapsed. Money has been printed like it was going out of fashion. So prices have risen, but incomes haven't. And so there's a huge problem there. So we will have this price inflation. It's not going to be reversed. It might be arrested, but it wouldn't be reversed. So I think it has to be a combination of, a targeted assistance program to address the food issue, which will mean a very broad expansion of the transfer programs. Now, it may not be a broad-based income transfer program, but this is still going to be a big issue. How to find the right people to target and so on. There's a political economy in this. I remember when Samruddhi was being rolled out, the bank had representatives saying, this is how you do the targeting, and this is how you make sure that, inefficient targeting is avoided. But people who understood even then the political economy of how things happen at grassroots level in Sri Lanka could understand that, there's always going to be these issues. You can minimize them at the margin. But in the short term, I think you got to really take have two programs. One, immediate emergency short-term program, where we will have to have restrictions on certain things. We can't import certain things. We have to allocate our foreign exchange to absolutely essential food, milk powder in particular, things like that. And then, even though they should not be held, those restrictions should not be kept on for long period. And then secondly, we should have a longer term strategy to get the country out of the macroeconomic mess more broadly, while ensuring that the food security of now it's like the bottom 50% of the population is addressed. Yeah, I'm afraid, again, I see the scale of the problem and the magnitude, but to come up with something practicable, which is going to be adequate without huge international assistance, in the immediate short term, we are going to pay a big price. In the long term, as Pradeepa said, malnutrition and the effects of those will be felt over the long term in stunted brain development, all those things.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Jayasuri. I think we have already gone beyond 12:30 p.m., so we can wind up the webinar now. I suppose we had a very productive 1 hour and 30 minutes time. I hope all of you benefited from the 3 interesting presentations and the very lively discussion. So without just limiting to the presentation, we hope we would be able to disseminate a summary of the webinar as a blog article, probably. I thank very much 3 resource persons for the time they had taken from the busy schedules, as well as for all of you for your participation. And special thanks should go to Dr. Suresh Babu for deciding to land in Sri Lanka at this time, just for this seminar during his official visit in the Southeast Asian region. It's a separate visit. Thank you all again, and I wish all a good day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manoj, and thank you, Professor Sisita, for all good feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you,
Manish.
everyone. Thank you, Devika. Thank you, Pradeepa. Bye.
Thank you, Suresh. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.